Let's go ahead and start with a review of the quiz from last week. You may not have seen these questions in the same order because they get scrambled for everybody. But question number 1 in this version says, according to Roger Williams, the Gentiles of America are most likely the Jews, the Indians, or the Dutch. We have different answers from everybody here. Turn to the page. Turn to the page, Roger Williams. He did compare them to the Jews, that's correct. But go to page 106. Page 106. Second paragraph from the bottom on page 106. Now because of this great inquiry of all men, here's the inquiry. What Indians have been converted? What have the English done in those parts? What hopes of the Indians receiving the knowledge of Christ? And because to this question some put an edge from the boast of the Jesuits in Canada and Maryland, and especially from the wonderful conversions made by the Spaniards and Portugals in the West Indies, besides what I have here written, as also, besides what I have observed in the chapter of their religion, their religion. Who's he referring to? Whose religion? The Indians' religion. I shall further present you with a brief additional discourse concerning this great point. The great point being, what about the conversion of the Indians? Being comfortably persuaded that the Father of the Spirits, who was graciously pleased to persuade Japhet the Gentiles, so the original Gentiles, the Gentiles from the Bible, to dwell in the tents of Shem, the Jews. So in the Bible there were the Jews and everybody else. Everybody else would have been the Gentiles according to the biblical tradition. But according to Roger Williams, he goes on and says, the Jews will in his holy season, God's holy season, I hope approaching, so he's hoping God's holy season is coming. They will persuade these Gentiles of America to partake of the mercies of Europe. So he's referring to the Indians. He's saying that Indians would be the Gentiles because they are the non-Christians, I guess, or the non-believers in the European Christian God. Does that make sense? So back in the biblical times, you had the Jews who believed in God, and you had everybody else who didn't. Or, they believed in their own gods or whatever their traditions were. But in America, you have, taking the place of the Jews would be these European Christians, and everybody else would be the savages or the Native Americans or the Indians, however they were referred to. Okay, so the answer to number 1 would be the Indians. Those were the Gentiles of America, according to Roger Williams. Number 2, Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative. Did it make relations between the settlers and the Native Americans more volatile? Did it tell of how a Puritan family treated a Native American that they captured? Or did it make settlers of the New World more sympathetic to the hardships of Native Americans? A, it made things more volatile. Why? Okay, because it's the whole story of how the Native Americans captured a white person and how that white person was a white woman too. So that might make it even more volatile, right? Because it's like, look what they're doing to our women, right? It doesn't paint a good picture of the Native Americans overall. If you read just the first page, does anybody have a page for Rowlandson? Should be 100 and something. 127. Yeah, starts on 126 for the bio, the actual narrative. And this is just a portion of it. It starts on page 127 toward the bottom. If you just read the first page, you could probably answer this question. I mean, look what it says. On the 10th of February, 1675, came the Indians with great numbers upon Lancaster. Their first coming was about sunrising. Hearing the noise of some guns, we looked out. Several houses were burning and the smoke ascending to heaven. There were 5 persons taken in one house, the father and the mother and a sucking child. They knocked on the head. The other 2 they took and carried away alive. There were 2 others who, being out of their garrison upon some occasion, were set upon. One was knocked on the head. The other escaped. Another there who was running along was shot and wounded and fell down. He begged them of his life, promising them money, as they told me, but they would not hearken to him, but knocked him in the head and stripped him naked and split open his bowels. Stop there. Like, boy, who are the bad guys in this story, right? not the Europeans. And look where the story starts. Oh, it was just a nice day, and then boom, all of a sudden here come the Indians, and they're killing everybody. Doesn't go back and say, once upon a time there was a land where the Indians lived in peace, and the Europeans came and set up shop. Like, it doesn't start there, right? It starts with, the Europeans doing absolutely nothing wrong, just minding their own business, right? It doesn't mention anything about them being in the natives', home territory, right? So basically what this does, it paints a violent picture of the situation, a violent picture of the Native Americans, and it would have made relations worse. It would have made them more volatile, okay? So that, I think, is, and it was a very powerful story during this time. One, because it was written by a woman, and there weren't many female authors back then. And two, because they didn't have many outlets for entertainment back then, right? There are three purposes for writing, and since we're studying literature, it helps to know this. The three purposes of writing are to entertain, to persuade, or to inform, and they can all mix together. All right, so for instance, like a textbook for chemistry is probably written to inform, right? That's the goal of the book. However, it might be persuasive that, there's one way to mix chemicals better than another way. And it might also be entertaining if they have like funny stories in there about experiments gone wrong, right? So the different purposes for writing can be combined and they can overlap, but typically there's one that's more important than the others. And for this story, this is one of the first pieces I think we've read whose primary purpose is probably to entertain, right? It's almost like an action movie, the way the book opens up, right? Like you've got this attack on a fort, and, I don't think she's necessarily writing just to inform people of what happened to her. I think she's embellishing. I think she's, picking the goriest details purposefully because she wants this to be something that, entertains people and captivates people. And so that might be part of the reason that a lot of students tell me, well, this is the first thing I read that I really liked. Well, maybe because it was written for you to like it. Like Christopher Columbus didn't write his letters for an audience to enjoy. His purpose was to inform the king and queen and possibly persuade them that they should keep giving him money and invest in this new land, right? This book wasn't necessarily written to persuade people. It was more like, hey, check out this cool story. Listen to what happened to me, right? If something interesting happens to you, you tell other people, not necessarily just to inform them, but you're like, listen to this. This is really exciting, interesting. This will entertain you, right? So you save your good stories for like dinner parties and things like that. Well, they didn't have movies back then. They didn't have radio yet. They didn't have TV. So this was one of the first outlets of entertainment you have in American history. What's that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But as far as literature goes, this may be one of the first that was written to entertain by an American author. One of the first, maybe not the first. All right, number 3. According to your assigned reading, it's remarkable that Puritans were so what? Highly educated, religious, or rich? Highly educated. That was remarkable. It's not remarkable that they were religious. Like, they were Puritans. That's what they did. That's pretty much, if you're a Puritan, you have to be highly religious. They weren't necessarily rich. Some of them did better than others, but they were in a new world, so money was not their primary goal. But it was remarkable they were educated because the infrastructure didn't exist in America. They were still trying to feed themselves, but yet they were still interested in education because they wanted to be able to better interpret their Bible. Number 4, the Puritans were persecuted for not interpreting the Bible literally, separating from the Church of England, or their creative literature. Separating from the church is why they were persecuted. So at first, they weren't persecuted. They were just kind of like, hey, we're going to just go over here and continue with the church. But eventually, they did break from the church, and they really couldn't stick around in England. They had to get out of there. At first they didn't, but eventually they did have to. So they were persecuted for that. And they definitely didn't have creative literature. They kind of squashed creativity, right? I mean, if you think about just the image of Pilgrims and Puritans in your mind, they wore the black and white, and they all dressed the same. There wasn't a whole lot of creativity going on amongst the Puritans. Yeah, similar to the Amish, pretty boring and drab. They were very anti-creativity, and it makes sense because they thought that there was, kind of one way to interpret the Bible. Their way was the right way, and pretty much anything outside the Bible was considered sin. Dancing was a sin, singing would have been a sin unless it was about God. What's that? hmm hmm I don't know if there's a link between those groups or not. I don't know. All right, number 5. The purpose of sinners in the hands of an angry God. Was it to convince sinners to accept Jesus Christ? Was it to convince Puritans of God's power? Or was it to mock the power of Satan? A is correct. Now, B is a tempting answer, to convince Puritans of God's power. That's a tempting answer because he does that in the sermon. He definitely does that. But he only does that because he's trying to get these people to accept Christ. We didn't get to talk much about this sermon, and this is one of my favorite pieces of American literature. It's on page, let me see if I can find it. What was it? 209, thank you. All right, the sermon starts on page 209. And he definitely does convince people of God's power, and he does that with these analogies and this imagery of, the one image that really sticks out in my mind is God is holding you like a loathsome insect over a lake of fire, right? That's pretty scary, right? Like, God has all the power. If he wants to, he can drop you at any time, just like a bug, right into the lake of fire. That's a powerful image, and that shows God's power. It also talks about God holding his wrath back like a dam would hold back a lake or a river, right? Holding back those waters, and if he wanted to, he could just let them go. That does indicate God's power, but the whole purpose of showing how powerful God is to ultimately convince these people to accept Christ. And the whole tone of the sermon changes at the end. At the beginning, yes, he's using these fear tactics. But when he gets to... Right. Look on page 219. So he spends the whole sermon saying, like, here's how powerful God is, here's how powerless you are, and he's particularly directing this sermon at the people that had not accepted Christ yet. So he's saying, like, you're the sinner, you're in big trouble, here's what God could do to you, you're lucky he hasn't done it yet. And he's basically trying to instill a fear in them, literally the fear of God. But when he gets to page 219, the second paragraph, which is like halfway down on the page, he says, "And now you have an extraordinary opportunity, a day wherein Christ has thrown the door of mercy wide open and stands in calling and crying with a loud voice to poor sinners, a day wherein many are flocking to him and pressing into the kingdom of God. Many are daily coming from the east, west, north, and south. Many that were very lately in the same miserable condition that you are in now are in a happy state, with their hearts filled with love to him who has loved them and washed them from their sins in his own blood, and rejoicing in hope and the glory of God. How awful is it to be left behind at such a day, to see so many others feasting, while you are pining and perishing, to see so many rejoicing and singing for joy of heart, while you have cause to mourn for sorrow of heart, and howl for vexation of spirit. How can you rest one moment in such a condition? Are not your souls as precious as the souls of the people at Suffield, where they are flocking from day to day to Christ?" So he's saying, here's how terrible things are, but you have a chance. You have a great opportunity today. So I guess my question is his style of sermon effective? Would it have been effective then? Would it be effective today? I mean, what did you think of it? Why do you think that? So why would people today be different than the people back then? Like, why, Gina, you said it would be more effective back then. Okay, so there are more options for people. That might change things. Good point. Very good point. So back then, if you didn't accept Christ, you could end up being ostracized from the community and maybe even kicked out. Um, so then, would this message have really been effective at truly converting people, or just getting people to say, "Yeah, I accept Christ"? Like, okay, I'm with you. Both. Hmm. But that's the thing. If it's not, I mean, conversion to Christ is supposed to be a full-hearted thing, right?
Because they're raised that way then, so wouldn't they?
Right. Hmm. Hmm. Something might click for you. So if they can just get you to keep coming back to church and just say it, even if you don't mean it. Okay. Okay. I can tell you that for me personally, that approach that he took would not have worked for me. You know, I would have been like, this guy's nuts. This like fear is not something I'm interested in. You know, like fear tactics aren't going to work on me. And by the time he got to that section on page 219 where he talks about like the love of God and the love of Christ, like he would have lost me already. I don't think I would have even mentally stuck around that long. I would have checked out mentally and just been sitting there. Maybe, possibly.
Because they were, like I said, they were raised in this. Everybody was came up that way.
Hmm.
All but in Virginia.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. Do you think he was trying to instill that kind of respect, though? Hmm. Right. Yeah. I think he was too, but I wonder about the imagery that he uses. When he compares the sinners sitting in front of him, the people sitting in front of him, to loathsome insects. Like if you're trying to win people over, you don't call them cockroaches, right? Right? If you're trying to get someone to agree with you or to, that's what the main purpose of this is persuasion, right? We said there are three purposes for writing: to inform, to entertain, and to persuade. He was not trying to entertain. Okay, good point. You can't force people. And is fear a tool of force? If I want your money, there are two ways I can go about getting your money. I could hold a gun to your head and say, give me your money, using fear. Or I could try and persuade you and be like, hey, I'm really hungry. I forgot my lunch today. Do you think I could get a couple bucks? That's two ways to get what you want, and he's obviously trying to get what he wants from his people in the church. So fear is that force, right? Because there's a difference between force and persuasion. There's a big difference between force and persuasion. And most people will say that persuasion is more effective because force only works as long as the person applying the force is there. So he might be able to convert these people with his fear tactics when he's right there and scaring him, but as soon as they leave and walk out that church, he's no longer there to instill that fear. All right, so if he can maybe persuade them a different way without fear, maybe using, I don't know, God's love or something like that instead, that might stick with them more. That might be more persuasive than forceful. Does that make sense?
That's the same thing as today. People go to church and they do while they're there and they leave it and leave it all there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Let's go to the bar now.
That's true. All right, I would love to keep talking about this, but
Yeah, no, you have got a point.
mhm.
It's
There was one other thing I wanted to say about this sermon. So let me just pick a random paragraph. How about, I like this one, 215, second paragraph. The bow of God's wrath, like the bow and arrow, right? The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice bends the arrow at your heart and strains the bow. And it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God and that of an angry God without any promise or obligation at all that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. Yikes, right? Yikes. So here's my question. You develop a mental picture of this guy giving the sermon. Develop a mental picture of this. All right? It's back, it's hundreds of years ago, probably in an old, musty church house, probably not a lot of light in there, maybe some candlelight. How is he presenting this information in your mind? Yes. Okay. But visually, what do you see? What do you hear? Is describe him as a speaker. Yelling, okay? Loud. Huh? Have you guys ever seen like the preachers that are like yelling and screaming? They have a towel in their hand usually because they're sweating so much. They're wiping the sweat off, right? They're all over the place. Yes. Yeah, have you heard like fire and brimstone preaching? Mhm. Right. Mhm. Yeah. Right. Terrified. Yeah. So is that how you would picture Jonathan Edwards? Uh-huh. Right. Mhm. Right. Right. Those emotions can come out. Sure. Mhm. Here's the thing about this sermon, though. The first time I read it, that's exactly how I pictured him. That's not how he did it. It's not how he did it at all. It's not how he did it at all. I want to say, this is a new edition of the book, so I don't know if it says it in here. But when he delivered this sermon, he stood perfectly still in front of a pulpit, and it says he stared at the back of the church. And the sermon, I don't think this is the entire thing. The entire sermon was like 6 hours long. And you don't get up to go to the bathroom during a sermon like that, right? And there are probably people holding it, but he was not jumping up and down and screaming. They said his eyes were fixed on the back of the church, and he spoke in a low, monotone voice the entire time. And if you ask me, I think that is almost more terrifying than someone jumping around. When this guy's talking about the wrath of God and making the arrow drunk with your blood, and he's just straight saying it, that's scary. His presentation was completely not what I expected. And what I expected was exactly what you guys just said. That's what I thought. The fire and brimstone preaching, the hopping around on the stage. It may be in the biographical information. If it's not, you can research background on the sermon. But it makes sense. It makes sense because I told you that there's a characteristic of Puritan writing, and there's a name for their style. Do you remember what it was? Puritan plain style was the name of their style. And why did they use that style in writing? Right. Right. So what happens when a preacher's jumping up on stage and bouncing around and screaming? What are you focusing on, the style or the content? You're focusing on the style. You're like, whoa, this guy's nuts, right? And that's why that style wouldn't work for me. I just be like, this guy's absolutely crazy. I don't even know what his message is, but he's nuts, so I don't want to have anything to do with it. But that wasn't Jonathan Edwards' style. He was a Puritan. He wanted people to be focused on the message, not on him, right? So it fits really well with that idea of Puritan plain style. All right, let's move on. Next one. Number 6. Cotton Mather's work, The Wonders of the Invisible World, best describes the people of New England as peacefully spreading the gospel, Satan's army, or under attack. Under attack, very good. This was right around the time of the Salem witch trials, maybe right before. So these Puritans, they were terrified of demons and spirits, which makes sense. They're living out in the woods. It's a scary time for them. But he really thought that they were under attack by demons and witches and things like that. All right, number 7, Jonathan Edwards uses the image of a loathsome insect to represent Satan, the King of England, or non-Christians. Non-Christians would be correct. Number 8, which is a common theme in Puritan writing? The strong should always help the weak. Earthly success is unrelated to heavenly bliss, or life is a test. Life is a test for that one. That's life is a test. That is in the outline of American literature. It wouldn't be A, the strong should always help the weak, because they were more of the capitalist mindset, where it's like only the strong survive. You know, if you don't work hard enough, then you're not going to make it. Where is it? It might be in one of the writings, but it wasn't a common theme.
But it also pointed out life as a test.
Right. It specifically says life is a test in the outline of American Lit. Yeah. All right, number 9, Anne Bradstreet's poem, To My Dear and Loving Husband. The speaker of the poem prays for, is it a heavenly reward for her husband, love from her husband, or golden riches? Good, A. I'm glad you guys got that one. Let's take a look at that poem real quick. We haven't done any poetry yet, so let's take a look at that one. If you have the page number, just shout it out. 120. All right, so if you haven't done poetry before, or if it's been a while, I'll try to point out some things. I'll try to point out some things in this poem that are worth noting. First of all, the title. Titles of poems can be very informative. They can tell you a lot. This one, it says, To My Dear and Loving Husband, so we can make some assumptions. We can make the assumption that the poem was written to the writer's husband, or sometimes the speaker of a poem, which is the narrator, the person that's like telling the story or telling the poem. The speaker doesn't always have to be the person that wrote it, right? Like if I wanted to, I could write a poem from the perspective of a soldier in the Civil War, right? And I could use first person and say, you know, I just got shot in Gettysburg. You know, what a terrible day. If I wanted to, I could do that. So the speaker of the poem isn't Jason Palmer. The speaker of the poem is John Smith or John Williams, the soldier in the Civil War, right? Does that make sense? So the speaker isn't always the poet, but in this case, we can probably assume that the speaker is the poet. So we can make that assumption. We can assume that the poem is written to the husband, and this is the wife speaking. The poem starts out, if ever two were one, then surely we. So the poem starts out with what we call figurative language. There are two types of language, literal language and figurative language. All right? Figurative language is language that's not meant to be taken literally. It's the opposite of literal language. Right? Literal language, taken literally, means what it says. Figurative language is usually like a deeper meaning or a second meaning. All right? So it starts out with figurative language, and the type of figurative language here used has to do with the first line, if ever two were one. Can two be one? Literally? No. Two is two, one is one. They're two different things, right? Here's two, here's one. They're different. They're not the same. But she starts out the poem and says, if ever two were one. So if it were possible, if two were just one, then surely we. Right? Referring to her and her husband. Like if two people could become one soul, one body, then surely that's us. So this is actually a specific type of figurative language. Anybody know what that's called? When you have two things that are like really impossible? It's a paradox. This is a paradox, right? Two can't be one, but she's saying, if it were possible, then surely we are. So she's saying, two can be one, we are one. All right, so that's a paradox, and it's a type of figurative language. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. So if ever there was a man that was loved by his wife, then surely it's you, because the poem is written to the husband, right? If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the east doth hold. So we have some rhyming going on here too, right? We have rhyming going on. So there's musical language, right? Language that appeals to your sense of sound. That's what differentiates prose from verse. You need to know those two words, prose and verse. Prose and verse. Prose, P-R-O-S-E, and then verse, like the verse of a song, V-E-R-S-E. Prose and verse. Two different styles of literature. We study both in this class. So far, up until this point, we have only looked at prose. I believe this is the first verse we've looked at. Verse is a fancy word for poetry. So prose, what would be a good definition for prose? Ordinary language is perfect. It's just ordinary language. Poetry. Fancy word for poetry. Or poetic language or musical language. That's what verse is. It's musical language, it's poetry, it's poetic language. Now, prose can have figurative language too. I could use metaphors and things in just simple, ordinary language. Prose is pretty much everything that's not poetry. Like, I'm speaking in prose right now. If you went to a Shakespeare play, they'd be speaking in verse, because he wrote, like, his lines to rhyme sometimes, and they had, like, patterns and rhythm to the lines that they were speaking. May have been. Benjamin Franklin, everything you read from him that I know of, that was all prose. It was all ordinary language. There was no rhyming. There was no repetition for creating musical effects, nothing like that. I don't know. Find the quote. I do. I don't know what you're talking about, though. For Abraham Lincoln and Ben Franklin, I don't know what the relationship would be. There may be some things. There are things that Benjamin Franklin wrote, like A Stitch in Time Saves Nine. That's got some rhyming quality to it. But the stuff that I assigned you to read, I think that was just all prose. That was not verse. But Benjamin Franklin may have written some poetry and some verse. Like those things, those proverbs. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, so back to the poem. When she talks about all the riches that the East doth hold, she's saying she prizes his love more than all these riches. And then she goes on and says, my love is such that rivers cannot quench. So her love is a burning love, right? You ever hear that? Like I have a burning love or a burning desire for something. And her love is burning so fiercely that a river couldn't put out the fire. So what is that? My love is a burning desire. My love is such that rivers cannot quench, implying that it's a burning desire. Is her love or is her heart really on fire literally? No, so this is figurative language again. What kind of figurative language is this? She's comparing her love to a fire. What is it? You said it. Metaphor, because it doesn't use like or as. If you make a comparison between two things that are unlike, like a heart or love is not the same as fire. They're two very different things. But if you compare them without using the word like or as, it's called metaphor. If you use like or as, it's called a simile. Simile would be the other one. All right, they're both comparisons, though.
Wait, you said paradox, right?
A paradox is like an impossibility, I guess would be a good way to put it. It's an impossibility. Or a contradiction. That's even better. A contradiction. Like oxymorons are a type of paradox. An oxymoron would be like cold fire or plastic silverware, right? It's got to be one or the other. It's either plastic or silver. It can't be plastic silverware, right? So that's an impossibility. It's a contradiction. Like, which one is it, right? So two can't be one. Like, it's impossible. Mm-hmm. Probably. Simile. That was a comparison using like or as. Metaphor is a comparison without using like or as. So if she said, my love is like a fire rivers can't quench, it would be a simile. I mean, metaphors and similes are very close. She keeps going. Nor aught but love from thee give recompense. Recompense is payback. To compensate someone is to pay them. To recompense, recompensate is to pay someone back. So she's saying, like, you know, the love that I get from you is impossible for me to pay you back. Like, it's so much. There's nothing I could do. Therefore, thy love is such I can no way repay, since I can't pay you back. The heavens, I pray that the heavens reward thee manifold. Manifold means in many ways, in multiple ways. All right, so that's what she's praying for. She's praying that since she's not able to return his love, which is so much, that God will do it for her when he gets to heaven in many different ways. Does that make sense? Yes? I had to look up the word manifold just to make sure I had a decent interpretation of the poem. So, like, if you're... What's that? I often have to look words up when I'm reading this kind of literature. It very well could be. Yeah, I've heard of something just like that, actually, related to automobiles. But I had to look it up and just make sure, like, okay, now it makes sense. It said manifold, many ways. Will God reward him in many ways? Oh, that makes a lot of sense now. So stop. Look things up. If you read a sentence or a word that you don't understand, look it up. It will give you a better understanding of what you're reading. If you're not doing that, you probably should be, because I have to do it. Okay, so don't feel bad if you have to look stuff up. Then while we live in love, that while we live in love, let's so persevere, that when we live no more, we may live ever. So the poem ends with what? That when we live no more, we may live ever. Say it again. Forever and ever. So she's saying, so that when we live no more, when we die, we may live forever. That's a contradiction, right? She's saying when we die, we will live. Like, you're either dead or you're alive, right? Like, that's the idea. So what does the poem end with? It's an oxymoron. It's a paradox. Oxymoron is usually just confined to one word, like, or one thing. But this is like these two ideas. She's saying, so that when we live no more, when we're dead, we will live forever. Like, wait, you just said you won't live anymore. Of course she is. But it's still a paradox, right? Because she's saying our lives will end, but our lives will continue. Like, which one is it? Like, it's a contradiction. I mean, it makes sense if you understand the concept of eternity, but still, literally, the literal translation is saying literally, we're not going to live anymore, we're going to die, and then literally, we'll live forever. Like, pick one, right? It's an impossibility. What's that? Okay, that's right. All right, any questions about that poem? Do you see how much there is to it when you start looking at it? Like, we didn't really even get into, like, the rhyme scheme, but if you look at the first two lines, the last words, we and thee, then you have man and can, gold, hold, quench, recompense, repay, pray, persevere, and ever. All right, that's a rhyme scheme, A, A, B, B, C, C, D, D. So you can line it up that way if you wanted to, the end rhyme. That's part of poetry, right? Sometimes you have rhyme within a line, and that's called internal rhyme. The rhyme that we're looking at here is called end rhyme because the rhyme comes at the end of the line. So there's so much to this poem. It's a pretty short poem. It's only, 12 lines long? But we found multiple uses of figurative language. We found multiple uses of musical language. All right, so when you read poems, it's good to look for those things and look out for those. Okay, number 10. There are no examples of African American literature from the colonial period because African Americans could not read and write. That is false. Good. Where did you find the information? At the end of chapter 1, do you remember who it said the African American literary contributors were? One of them was Jupiter Hammond, who was a poet. Was that the only one in the outline, or did it refer to one other? There was another one? Let's see who the other one was. Did it mention Equiano, maybe? Oluwada Equiano. And technically, I put Oluwada Equiano in our next period that we're going to start studying right now. And I'll tell you why, but it did say Jupiter Hammond was a poet during the time. Yeah, it's on. If you have the printout, it's page 13. Jupiter Hammond, Black American poet, slave on Long Island, New York, remembered for his religious poems as well as for an address to the Negroes of the state of New York, in which he advocated freeing children of slaves instead of condemning them to hereditary slavery. And then Oluwada Equiano, we're actually going to read him next week. Correct. He wrote an autobiography. Correct. Correct. First African American poet. Yeah, you could probably say that. All right. Any questions for the quiz? No. That took longer than I thought, but that's okay. There was a lot of stuff we didn't get to talk about last week that we covered today. So I probably just didn't think about it or didn't have time. What happened was last week I didn't get to cover everything I wanted to cover. So by going over the quiz today, I'm able to kind of backtrack and talk about the stuff I didn't get to talk about last week. Does that make sense? So I guess the prior week I had already said everything I had to say. All right, so we are week 4 now. Checklist and the quiz are both available. This week, Outline of American Literature, Chapter 2. So we have a new literary time period this week. And in that time period, we have Benjamin Franklin assigned for this week, Krebs and Thomas Paine. All right, so we have 3 authors, kind of light on the reading this week. I will tell you right now for next week, because you need to know this if you're working on Essay 1, which you should be because it's due next week. I will tell you the readings for next week right now so you can do those, or if you need to. Okay, so the Revolutionary period that we're starting today, it extends into next week too. Your essay has to go through the Revolutionary period. That's the end of next week, right?
That's the next.
The end of week 5. Right, so this is week 4. Week 4 ends on the 16th. Week 5 ends on the 23rd. The essay is due on the 23rd. So the Revolutionary period I'm breaking into 2 weeks. We're doing part 1 this week and part 2 next week. So if you waited until after I'm done talking about part 2 of Revolutionary period, you've only got like 3 or 4 days to finish your essay. So that's why I'm just trying to give you, a little advance notice of what the readings will be next week. If you're going to be working on your essay and want to, like let's say you picked, I don't know, the question about technology, and you don't feel like you saw anything about technology in these readings from the Revolutionary period. Well, I've given you next week's readings so you can look at those too if you're working on your essay now. Does that make sense? Yes? I'll get there in just a second. Let me give you the readings for next week, though. You've got Equiano, E-Q-U-I-A-N-O, I believe. Equiano. A-N-O, yeah. Page 354 to 387. That's a big one. 354 to 387. That's the biggest reading, or the longest reading you have for next week. Then we have Benjamin Franklin again. Short one. 244 to 247. 244 to 247. Crevecoeur again, 319 to 323. 319 to 323. The Federalist Papers, 345 to 348. Crevecoeur was 319 to 323. Federalist Papers, 345 to 348. So that's a short one too, just a couple pages. And then Phyllis Wheatley, W-H-E-A-T-L-E-Y, Phyllis Wheatley, 401 to 403. The essay has to be, your first 3 primary sources must come from the assigned readings. If you decide to do some that weren't assigned, you can, as long as your first 3 came from the assigned readings. So if you want to do a 4th or a 5th that weren't assigned readings, go for it. But you have to start with the assigned readings first. You've got to cover those. The actual assigned reading, whatever these authors were studying actually wrote. So not what the editor in the textbook writes about Benjamin Franklin's life, but the actual documents that Benjamin Franklin wrote, or that Crevecoeur wrote, or that Thomas Paine wrote. So like your Outline of American Literature, that's a secondary source, not a primary source. That's a primary source, because she wrote it. If anything Jonathan Edwards actually wrote, his actual sermon, primary source. The biographical information before it, that the editors of the textbook wrote, secondary source.
What about when he was doing this? He said, when he said,
Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
yes,
That's a primary source. Yes, it is. You can work it into your essay, but the quiz for him is done with. That was last week.
So we can work on it.
Wait, yes you do. You have a week 4 quiz. There it is. It's right there.
Mr. Conlon,
No discussion board this week. No discussion. How about that?
no,
You have a quiz. You're going to have a quiz pretty much every week.
Well, me too, because I don't like that deadline.
All right, you will have a quiz pretty much every week. All right,
Say that?
we need a discussion. We have to have discussion.
Well, but you put it, for the first response, you put a deadline on it.
Mhm.
For me,
I have to.
put Sunday.
I have to. They're time sensitive because if I didn't put a deadline on the first response, everybody would wait until the last minute, and then nobody would be able to respond to other people.
No, because I do mine, I do my response, and
Mhm.
then I do my first post.
Okay.
Go back and respond all in one day.
Yeah, I like that idea. Okay, but I have to have them spread apart to give people time to respond to other people's original responses.
How many points do you lose if you're not
Mm,
successful?
I only grade the on-time responses. So like if you didn't get your original response in on time, I'll grade your replies to other people. You'll get credit for those, but probably not for the original one.
Well, I'm like, I don't think I have a big list.
It depends. Like, it depends. Sometimes I'll grade them not just for quantity. Like, I'll check this to make sure you have the appropriate word count, which is 100 words and then 50 and 50. And then sometimes I'll read through and make sure that they're quality. Actually, what I look for too is that you're doing the in-text citations and supporting your. If I ask for it in the instructions, if I say use cited information, and you don't use cited information, you're not going to do very well. Hmm? Your replies don't have to have in-text citation, unless you're referring to something from the book. All right, let's look at the Outline of American Literature, Chapter 2, and introduce our new literary time period. So we're moving from the colonial period. That's not right. Did anybody try this link yet?
Which of the two? It's not the one.
That link wasn't working?
No, but you can go back, it's on the other.
You want to see the quiz? Is that what you said?
That's what it is.
Yeah, let's go to the quiz.
Yeah. I've almost done that by mistake before. But.
We cannot pass, so
All right, so if you can't get to it from that link, go to Lessons and Supplementary Resources, and we can just do the PDF version.
you see it.
All right, Chapter 2. This is the Revolutionary period. It also has aliases. It's the Revolutionary period. It's also called, and I don't know if this is explicitly stated in the chapter here, but it's also called, you need to know this, the Age of Reason. The Age of Reason. And there's one other alias. Anybody know what it is? Bingo! The Enlightenment. The Enlightenment. The Enlightened Age, that's pretty much the same thing. So you've got the Revolutionary period, also known as the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is actually an idea that started in Europe, like France and England. It started before and it made its way over to America. Here's something you need to know about these literary time periods. They are often reactions against the prior time period. They're often reactions against the prior time period. The literary time periods that we study, they are often reactions against the prior time period. So think about like generations. Generations often rebel against their parents' generations and try and do something completely different, right? This is a similar idea with these literary time periods. So our previous time period, the colonial period, it was all about, in one word, what would you say? all about what? I would say the previous period was the exploration. And the reaction against exploration would be settle down, right? So our first period was all about exploration. Then it was like, okay, what's the opposite of exploration? Settling down, right? As they settled down, they really got into, the literature that we study, it's called the Puritan/colonial period. So the literature was very religious, right? Most of the things we read, Jonathan Edwards, Cotton Mather, Rowlandson, not so much. But most of it was about God and religion, okay? So the reaction comes with the Age of Reason, right? This is going to be the reaction against the prior period. It usually works that way. So the people were kind of, I don't want to say fed up with religion, but they were fed up with the way that religion was being carried out. They were kind of sick and tired of being told what to do, right? Think about America during this time. Our years, I'll give you the starting point, is going to be 1750. 1750. And that's kind of a round number that I decided to go with. Like you can see the textbook here, the outline says 1776 to 1820. I do 1750 because 1776 was kind of a culmination of a lot of efforts that led to the actual Revolutionary War and the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the writing of the Constitution. Right? There were things that happened before 1776 in the literary world that are important to note. Okay, so it's 1750 for a starting point, and now I lost my track of thought. Can't remember what I was going to say. Go ahead. It has to. Your essay has to cover all three periods. So this is the third leg of the paper. So if you've already started and covered the first two, you just have to work this in there too. You have to add this on.
You were thinking we'd send there that
Hold on, you're getting ahead of me. I was talking about the characteristics of the time period and the Age of Reason and how it's a reaction against the prior time period. So the prior time period, it was very religious. You know, the Puritans basically accepted what the Bible told them and what their preacher, Jonathan Edwards, told them. And the people of America were having to accept what? From a governmental standpoint. What were the people of America having to accept during that time? They were colonies of Britain, so they were ruled by the king. So they weren't self-ruling themselves. They were having to accept whatever the king said, whatever the Bible said. So like they didn't really have a whole lot of what Roger Williams identified as freedom of conscience or freedom of thought, right? Roger Williams was kind of like out of his place during that time period because he was like, wait a minute, I don't want to be told all this stuff. Roger Williams would have been better off in the Revolutionary period, but he was kind of ahead of his time. So you've got all these people that are being told what to do, you know, by the church, by the preachers, by the Bible, by the king, you know, by the king's governors that were sent over here. They were colonies. They weren't their own country yet. So what's the reaction to that? A revolution, right? To revolt, to rebel, right? To go against what you've been told to do. And that's why it's the Revolutionary period. The country, the colonies, revolt and stage a revolution against the king. And also, this idea of the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, reason is kind of the opposite of faith. Reason is the opposite of faith because faith cannot be proven scientifically. Faith cannot be proven. Reason can. They're two different things. I don't know. Rewind the tape. I don't know. Faith and reason are opposites. So the prior time period, people were relying on faith. They were kind of just, you know, relying on their religious faith, relying on faith that the king would tell them to do the right thing. Eventually, though, they got to a point and they were like, you know what, we're not so sure about this. I don't think that the king should be really telling us what to do when he's not even here. He doesn't even know what's going on. He wants all this tax money from us, but he doesn't realize we don't have it, you know? So they decided to revolt. So there's two different revolts going on. There's a revolt in government, right? They're revolting against the policies and the politics of the king. But there's also an intellectual revolt where people want to start thinking for themselves, and they're more interested in what can be proven rather than what is just accepted on faith. When you think about Ben Franklin, what comes to mind? You ever see the picture of him, or hear about him flying a kite in a thunderstorm? That's a scientific experiment, right? Science is the opposite of religion. Science proves things logically. It proves things with reason. Religion can't do that. Okay, so when you think about the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, think about Ben Franklin flying a kite up in a thunderstorm with a key at the end of it because he's trying to generate electricity through the string of the kite and prove that, electricity travels through water or whatever he was doing. Okay? So he was doing a science experiment. And that's what this time period is about. It's about science over religion. All right, let's see what it says in the actual chapter. Okay, this is pretty interesting. When we talk about literary time periods, we're talking about cultural time periods because literature is part of culture. So cultural time period equals literature and art. The Outline of American Literature says cultural revolutions, right? When we change from one literary time period to another, it's a literary revolution, it's a cultural revolution. So cultural revolutions, unlike military revolutions, cannot be successfully imposed, but must grow from the soil of shared experience. That's a pretty good quote there. So the problem was it was difficult for America to have its own literary tradition at this point, right? Because the people didn't all have a perfectly shared experience. They didn't all consider themselves American yet, right? Like the people that actually came over usually isolated themselves in pockets. Like you had Germans living in, German areas of the town. You had the French living in the French areas of the town. The people from England living in their own towns. Has anybody ever heard of I'm from Pennsylvania, and there's a place in Pennsylvania called Germantown, Pennsylvania, because that's where the Germans went and settled. All right, and I mean now we have other towns that came long after, San Francisco has Chinatown. There's a Chinatown in Philadelphia. There's a Chinatown in New York. I don't know if those are official names, but those are names of the areas where these people go and kind of, gather and share their cultures. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's been going on since the very early people came over. Think about Gainesville. They call part of Gainesville Little Mexico, right? And there's a high concentration of a Hispanic population there, so it still happens today. But these cultural revolutions have to come from a shared experience. So this is about the time when people were really starting to share a uniquely American experience, because regardless of whether you lived in Germantown or Chinatown or whatever back then, you were sharing this experience of revolting against the king. All right, not everybody was necessarily revolting against the church, but everybody wanted freedom from I say everybody. Many people wanted freedom from the king and his laws. All right, so they're starting to share this experience, and that's what helps to generate the literature that we're going to read, okay? Because everybody can identify with this common cause, right? Like yesterday was the anniversary of September 11th. That is a cultural experience that everyone in this room shares, because we're all American. We probably all experienced it. We can identify with it. So if we, saw a book or a poem or something about September 11th, we can all kind of identify with that, and that could be part of our cultural experience. Well, back then, the literature that we're going to read is more about the Revolutionary War and, hating the king and his policies and things like that. Or, a lot of people shared this idea of, hating religion because it was so do as I say. It was so rigid. that it didn't allow for freedom of thought. So a lot of people started to share that idea too. All right, it also says, this is important, it would take 50 years of accumulated history for America to earn its cultural independence. 50 years of accumulated history for America to earn its cultural independence. So it's saying 50 years after we achieved political independence, that's when we achieved cultural independence. They're two different things. So we didn't produce a real, like it goes on to say, it took us that long to produce the first generation of great writers. So we didn't produce this generation until basically 1820. All right, so there are two different things going on. You've got political independence versus cultural independence. America was not culturally independent during this time period, which means they relied on the art and the literature from their home countries or whatever they brought over with them. All right, they were still relying on that. So if you went to the bookstore back then and wanted to buy like the bestseller, it's not going to be written by some guy that's a colonist in America. It's going to be written by William Shakespeare or something like that. All right, so the bestsellers are going to be from authors overseas from the home countries, and that's what America was still relying on those. They were producing literature, but it wasn't the same as literature produced in their home countries. Does that make sense? Yeah. Mm-hmm. There are other reasons for that too. Like look here, it says until 1825, most American authors paid printers to publish their work. Boy, what a crappy profession, right? Imagine if you went to work and had to pay your boss to work there. Like that doesn't make sense, right? So writing as a profession wasn't really around. Like people didn't get paid to write in America yet. And there are reasons for that. One of the reasons is they were pirating the literature from overseas because the copyright laws were tough to enforce over here. Just like China right now bootlegs DVDs from Hollywood producers because we can't really enforce American copyright laws in China. So they create American filmmakers make a movie over here. They spend millions and millions of dollars to pay the actors, and they spend all this money for a movie, and then they want to sell it. They want to sell their DVDs for $15 or $20 a piece, but that's because they charge licensing rights to the people that create the movies. Well, they can't do that to the Chinese. So the Chinese get a hold of it. They start burning copies. They sell them for $2 or $3 a piece over there, or ship them back here and try and sell them for $2 and $3 a piece. They're able to do that. Well, they steal it. It's easily accessible though. You can download stuff from the internet pretty easily. I don't know. But back then, this was going on too. It was the same thing. It was just with books. So they could get a copy of Shakespeare's book, and they didn't have to pay. I mean, Shakespeare would have been dead by this point, but they didn't have to pay his family or his estate or whatever writers were popular at the time in England. They didn't have to pay for the work. So if you're a publisher over in America, why am I going to pay Joshua Potter money for his book and pay him money for every copy sold when I can get the guy over in England who's got a really popular book already, print it for free, and everything I make is profit after that, right? Makes sense. So the copyright laws had a lot to do with it. All right, I'm almost out of time. Americans still wanted European authors. They still had a hunger for the literature of their home countries. Europe wanted American lit, which is interesting. Europe wanted American lit. Why would Europe want American lit? See what it's like over here. That'd be entertaining, right? Like, wow, we've got these new colonies. I wonder what's going on over there. And also, what kind of stuff were the Americans writing during this period? Revolutionary stuff. Like they were dissing the king, right? So if you're in England, it's like, ooh, I want to read that, right? Like, wow, these Americans they're not Americans yet, I guess technically, but these colonists, they're saying bad things about the king. That'd be fun to read, right? It was. That's what they wanted to read because, at some level, usually subjects or what? Say it again.
You like they were writing something here about the king and it was bad?
Yeah.
They know the county.
Oh, over in England? Yeah, he could try to. Yeah. Yeah, it could get people in trouble, absolutely. Yeah, so it was revolutionary literature, and these people were going out on a limb to write these things. So yeah, it was definitely Sure. Yeah, it was salacious, I guess you could call it. Scandalous. All right. Brazen, I like that. All right, so the American Enlightenment, it talks about that on page 16 of this. It says the 18th century American Enlightenment was a movement marked by an emphasis on rationality rather than tradition. Rationality rather than tradition. Tradition means you just do things because that's the way they've always been done, right? Why do we, have cake for our birthdays? Well, because we've always had cake for our birthdays. Nobody ever thought about it. Like, why isn't it fish for birthdays? I don't know. Like, it's a tradition. But people stopped just accepting things. People stopped accepting being told what to do by the king and by the church. They're like, wait a minute, we want to think for ourselves. That's what the Enlightenment was. All right, the age of reason, ration, logic. Those are all the same. Reason, ration, and logic. Rationality, reason, and logic. They're all the opposite of tradition and faith. And what's it say? Marked by an emphasis on rationality rather than tradition, scientific inquiry instead of unquestioning religious dogma, and representative government in place of monarchy. So there are a couple things going on here, but they're all related. Like, people want to think for themselves. They want to represent themselves in government instead of just being told what to do. And then it goes on to talk about the different authors. You need to know about the political pamphlet and political writings and how they were the most prevalent writings of the time. Hint, hint. Rewind the recording. The political pamphlet section is very important.
So I guess this is when the state representatives and all this stuff started coming into play. Or started
Not yet, because your representatives of the different colonies at this point were still put in place by the king.
So I mean, was the idea here?
The idea of ruling of democracy was coming about in America here. It had already existed the French Revolution was trying to get at it, and before that, you've got the Greeks were the first ones to really think about this idea of democracy. So the idea had been around for a long time, but in practice, it was not around in America until this point. All right, other things to look out for. Who wrote about the diversity of America? Thomas Paine's A Crisis. What is it? Like, what is it as a piece of literature? What is his intent? A Crisis is the title of it. Yeah, what is it? According to Paine, and I'm basically giving you the question here. According to Paine, who chose war? Who chose war? According to Paine. What set Ben Franklin apart from other published writers? You might be able to answer that right now. That's one of the things. But we also just said that until 1825, most American authors paid the printers to publish their work. Why didn't he have to pay the printer to publish his work? Because he worked at Kinko's, right? He was able to publish his own stuff, right? So that made his job easy. And that may have something to do with what you just said about, how he decided to label his work. Ben Franklin's... You need the room? They're free to leave if they want. I'm just going over quiz stuff. Ben Franklin's view of taxes. Ben Franklin's view of taxes. All right, that's it. We covered everything else.